Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, so welcome to our already final lecture of the fall semester. We are always thrilled to welcome people here to Greenspun College and Greenspun Hall, and our colleagues who make this space available to us. And tonight's lecture, as you can see, is recorded. It'll be up on our website in a few days, as will our speaker's PowerPoint. So do not hurt yourself trying to take notes. There's a requirement when you give an economic lecture that there be at least one table or slide per person. So a lot of data to be presented tonight, but it'll be available if you want to check on it at all. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight, Dany Bahar. He's a fellow in global economy and development at Brookings. He's an Israeli and Venezuelan economist, and he's also an associate at the Harvard Center for International Development. His research sits at the intersection of international economics and economic development. And of course, we here in Southern Nevada, have been focused on our own economic development for quite intensively, and how to diversify our economy. And so we're going to have a sort of global perspective on this. This is Dany's first trip to Las Vegas and UNLV, so he's been getting immersed in our issues and challenges. And we look forward to having him back to pick up on some of the things he's going to talk about tonight. He's worked and consulted for multilateral development organizations such as the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And as many of you know, we're standing or sitting at the most diverse public university in the country. And Dany has quite a diverse education background. He holds a BA in systems engineering from the Universidad Metropolitana in Caracas, Venezuela, an MA in economics from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a master's in public administration and international development from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a PhD in public policy from Harvard. So I'm not sure we could have a better speaker to address this topic tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dany.
A lot of student there. I'm just kidding. Well, thank you so much for coming and for having me, and I'm thrilled to be here, and it's so exciting to share with you some of the insights of my own research and some of my colleagues. And I really look forward to discussing this with you. Perhaps at the end, I think we're going to have some time for Q&A. So the topic today that I work on very deeply is the idea of economic growth, and how, in particular, we can think of the diversification of a country's export basket as one of the measures that explain economic growth, and what policies can be put in place to promote growth. And we should start by acknowledging something that sometimes we forget, but economic growth is a very recent phenomenon. Actually, it really kicked off last century. Until the 1900s, the GDP of the world was pretty flat. And it's only in the last century that actually countries experienced a lot of the growth, and it took only 100 years, or a little bit more, to be at the levels that we are now today. But with that, of course, it came a lot of divergence as well. So many regions in the world developed at very different paces, and growth didn't pick up as much as in some places as in others. And this is a bit of the most important question, to me at least, in economics, which is, why are some countries rich and some countries are still poor? Like, what really explains that, if there's one answer that can explain that together? And when Adam Smith wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations, the richest country in the world was 4 times richer than the poorest country in the world. If we look at that today, the poorest countries in the world today are Congo, Burundi, Guinea-Bissau, and Eritrea, with GDPs that are just in the $100 range. And if we multiply that by 4, we get to countries such as Haiti, Guinea, Bangladesh, and Kenya. And if we multiply that by 4 again, we get to Cape Verde, Turkmenistan, Ecuador, and Guatemala, We can keep doing this, and we're going to see Chile, Mexico, Croatia, and Czech Republic. We are getting to middle-income countries after we multiply by 4 3 times. And then we can keep going. If we multiply those countries by 4, we get countries such as Australia, Belgium, Germany, and Canada. And we can keep going, and we see that the richest countries in the world, that are a little bit more than the ones I just mentioned, are Hong Kong, Switzerland, United States, and Japan. But today, actually, the US, which is one of the richest countries in the world, is 387 times richer than the Democratic Republic of Congo, or 145 if we control for the purchasing power. So, there has been a huge divergence in growth. We can see this in the global income distribution. This is how economists think of inequality and measure inequality. This is how they measure the Gini index. This is basically a graph that is showing the percentage of the world population and what is the percentage of income that population has. So you see that actually it's only a very tiny portion of the world population that has most of the income. The difference between these two lines, or the area between these two lines, is what economists refer to as the Gini coefficient. The higher the Gini coefficient, the more inequality there is. Yet, the world economy has grown quite significantly. And then the question is, is everybody better off? And one question that Dany Rodrik, a former professor of mine, used to ask, that I think is quite interesting, is would you rather be rich in a poor country or poor in a rich country? So I wonder how many people here would rather be rich in a poor country? And how many people here would rather be poor in a rich country? Okay. Well, Norway's poorest 5% has a representative income of $13,000, whereas in Niger, the richest 5% of the population has a representative income of $2,000. So poor people in rich countries are way better off than rich people in poor countries. So overall, while we've seen a lot of growth, we've seen also a very important rise in inequality. And economists have worked on this question for many, many years. Of course, I'm not the first one to think about it. And there's a lot of things that economists think that actually explain economic growth. And one very simple framework to think about it is here. So there's income, which is the ultimate thing that economists are interested about. Not the ultimate thing, but one of the things that they're interested about. And what explains a lot of the income is the endowments you have, how many workers, how much capital, and so on. Also productivity. The more productive you are, is the more you can do with the same resources. There's a bunch of other things, such as whether the country is integrated in the global economy, trade, FDI, migration, and so on. The institutions the country has, if there's corruption, if there's no corruption, if the Supreme Court works, if there's property rights, and all these kind of things. And there's also a geographic component. Some countries might be better off because they're not in the tropics, and so on. This is a lot to cover in 45 minutes, so I won't. But I want to focus today in one particular issue, that is productivity. And in economics, when we think about productivity, we don't really have a very good idea on what we're talking about. But what we do know is that productivity is almost by far the most important determinant of economic growth. Our ability to do more with the same resources is what explains growth the most. And in fact, this is a graph that shows that about 60% of what explains cross-country income differences are productivity differences. So countries that are more productive tend to be richer, and vice versa. So it is a big component that is worth paying attention to. But then the question is, what is productivity? And an economist would say it's a measure of our own ignorance. Because basically, productivity is everything that we cannot account for in economics. So you have, for each firm or for each country, you have a number of workers, a number of machines, and so on, and you have a given income. And you should expect that the things that you can account for will explain the income, but there's always a gap, and that gap is what economists call productivity. However, I want to propose a measure or a definition of productivity that I think we could all agree with, which is productivity is knowing how to do more with the same resources. You're more productive when you can do more with the same resources that you have. And the knowledge part is the one that I'm going to be focusing quite a bit today. let me start with a premise of why do we think that the way the sectors that countries are active in, or the products that a country exports, are really important for growth and economic growth. And this is the premise of structural transformation. Structural transformation is the process through which countries move towards more productive activities, and that makes them grow faster. For example, in very big terms, the US was had a very large agricultural sector a few centuries ago. Then it moved towards having a very large manufacturing sector, and today it moved towards having a very large services sector. So that process through which there's some transformation of the sectors that a country has is what economists refer to as structural transformation. And this process is critical for economic growth. It can explain a lot of growth. And it has basically two components. The first component is the ability of the sectors, or the firms, if you may, to become more productive by investing in their own workers, by investing in new machinery, by learning how to do things better, and so on. The other component is what we refer to as reallocation of resources. Throughout the lifetime of a country or a sector, or at whatever unit you want to look at it, there are some sectors and some firms that simply are not competitive enough, and they exit the market. And a lot of the resources that these firms are shedding out, they should go to the most productive firms in the market. And that reallocation of resources from the least productive sectors to the most productive sectors explains a lot of the economic growth. Now, the question is, like, telling you this story, if you think of sectors as the different products in a country's export basket, because if you, in particular, it's interesting to look at exports, because when you're exporting something, it means that you are really productive at doing that good, differently than just producing it. When you're exporting, it means that you are selling it at world prices and you are competitive enough. So given what I just told you, what should we expect of the evolution of a country's export basket? Should they be specialized in a few goods? Should they be diversified in a few others? So the answer to this, as any other question that you would ask to an economist, is it depends, right? I think President Woodrow Wilson was the one who said at some point, I want you to bring me a one-handed economist, because economists always say, on one hand, this happened, on the other hand, this happened. So every question has an answer that depends on the circumstances. So on one hand, as productivity rises, you would expect that all sectors will benefit from larger productivity, and therefore you will see countries diversifying into many different sectors. On the other hand, increasing international trade provides all the incentives for countries to specialize in different sectors, because if I'm good at making something and you're good at making something else, that should be more efficient. That should be a more efficient allocation of resources, and we can just trade in between both of us. I should stick to what I'm good at, you should stick to what you're good at, and then we'll just trade. So there are these two forces of specialization and diversification going against each other. So let's look a little bit at the data and what should we expect. So this is some work that was done in a very known economic journal in almost 15 years ago, a paper called The Stages of Diversification. And this paper is asking the question, what should we expect in terms of the concentration or diversification of an economy given the different stages of development that the country is in? And they find a very strong pattern, which is the following. What we have here on the y-axis basically is the Gini coefficient, not of income, but of production. So how concentrated is the production basket of a country? So a very high Gini coefficient, it means that 80% or 90% of your sales are concentrated in one particular sector, for example. So what they find is that countries that are very poor, they are highly concentrated, and then as they grow, they diversify quite a bit. And after a certain point, they re-specialize a little bit more again. So these are the different stages of development. They first diversify, and then after a certain midpoint, you actually re-specialize. And I was thinking about this fact because I thought that when you actually look at the raw data, you see a little bit of a different pattern. Okay, so countries that are richer they tend to be much less concentrated or much more diversified. So here again, we have the export concentration, and here we have the GDP per capita, and you see here that the richest countries, such as Singapore and Switzerland and the US should be around here, and Canada and so on, they're very, very highly diversified. Their concentration is very low. And the countries that you have here that are kind of the ones are a little bit outliers, right? These are countries that are very highly concentrated, but they're also very rich. And these are basically oil exporting countries. Venezuela, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, Oman. By the way, Venezuela now is going to be like a bunch of points back, unfortunately. So, I was thinking about this and say, how come, these two things don't really fit, these two facts are not really consistent with each other. So, the first thing that we should correct for, to some extent, is what I just mentioned, the natural resources. So when we redo this exercise, excluding countries that are rich in natural resources, we find that, first of all, across the board, all countries are less concentrated. All right, this is the orange line. But also, the re-specialization is not as strong for the richest countries. So that's one part of the puzzle. But we still see a little bit of re-specialization here. So we still see here that the richest countries are not as diversified as we would expect. We basically would have expected maybe the graph to go down all the time, all the way. So then I ask another question, which is, well, maybe there's something here about measurement, right? And I did this when I was in Paris. This is not my hand, but the question is like, is measurement playing a role here in providing us like some confounding facts? And actually, when you look at the exports data, measurement matters, and the way that you use the definition of products and how narrowly defined the products are, they can play a role. So this is just an example, for instance, of how products are classified in the harmonized system classification. So when you think about 1 digit, the category is called vegetable products. When you go to 2 digits, it's called cereal. When you go to 4 digits, it's called rice. And then when you go to 6 digits, it's called semi-milled or wholly milled rice, whether or not polished or glazed. Right? So there's a bit of a thing here of how are we defining products when we're measuring concentration or diversification. Turns out that this also plays a role in explaining this pattern. Because this is the same pattern I showed you before, in which countries first diversify and then they re-specialize. But this is measured when we use 3 digits. This is measured when we use 2 digits. So you see re-specialization pattern is much stronger. And this is how it looks when I use 6 digits. So here you see that the re-specialization pattern almost kind of disappear. So the richest countries actually are very highly diversified. And I would assume that if there was more data to go to 8 digits and 10 digits and 12 digits, we're going to see actually that the line becomes lower and lower on the right-hand side of the graph. And one good example to look at this is to compare two countries that are at the two ends of the distribution. So we have Korea, which is a very rich country, which would be on the right-hand side of the graph before, and we have Malawi, which is a very poor country, on the left-hand side of the graph before. And this is how their export basket looks when you only consider the 2 digits classification. If you actually count the number of products, they're pretty much the same products, or the same quantity of products, right? So here, they're very different products, but in terms of quantity, they're very similar. This is what happens when we go to 4 digits. Right? So Korea is highly, much more diversified than a country like Malawi. So this matters because this tells us a lot of things. It tells us the fact that the path to growth has to do with diversification. It's at least correlated with it. And it tells us that countries tend to diversify within larger sectors. Maybe they're specialized in certain sectors, but within the sectors, they remain highly diversified. So then the question is like, what explains diversification? If we know that there's a very strong pattern from just what I show you and the research of many other people that links diversification with growth and development, what explains diversification? Well, this is Ricardo Hauptmann, who's a professor at Harvard, and he's the director of the Harvard Center for International Development, and he has done quite a bit of work on this. And they've shown that diversification really responds to the local composition of a country's export basket, which means that the existence of related products strongly predict the emergence of new products. So if a country is exporting television screens, it's very likely that they're going to actually diversify towards computer screens because these are related products, and he has a way to measure them, which in the economist language means that there are some cross-industry spillovers. So if you have an industry, the technology and the know-how of that industry can spill over to a very related industry, and also that could be translated into more competitiveness for both industries. And this is the way that he and his co-authors have has visualized this through this network, which they call the product space. And in this network, each product that exists in the world is a node. And the nodes are together, the more related they are in terms of the know-how that they share or the technology that they share. So what they found many interesting things looking at this network. They found first that the countries that are rich, they actually tend to export goods that are in the middle of this network. And this is really explanatory of the process of development, because if you are in the core of the network, and that means that you are in a part of the network that you share a lot of know-how with many other products, so it's very easy to diversify. They also found that the poorest countries are the ones in which their firms are actually concentrated in the outskirts of the network, in which it's very hard to move towards new products, and therefore you stay in some sort of a poverty trap. Now, I'm not going to go very much into Ricardo's research because I want to talk about mine, but I do encourage you to go and look more about this. But this is an example, for instance, of Panama. And the example I want to show you here is how really the way that products emerge in an economy are not random, but they really respond to the relatedness that they have to the current export basket. So given the current export basket, the products that are going to appear in the future can be traced to the distance that they have in this network. So for instance, in the back you see sort of the skeleton of the network, and the nodes that are bolded are the actual products that Panama was exporting in 1980. Okay? So look at the location of the product. So they have a little bit here, which is the garment industry, and they have a little bit here in the middle, which is the machinery, but not a lot. And they have a lot of nodes around the outskirts of the network. When we move to 1990, you see that actually the picture, they have now more goods, but the goods are close to the ones that they had before. So now they expanded more around the garment sectors. They still don't have a lot here in the machinery, and they kept and expanded a little bit their products in the outskirts of the network. We move more. They did even better in the garment sector. They really conquered almost all the products in the garment sectors, and all that part in the upper part of the network. And also they've expanded on this light blue part, which are chemicals, if I'm not mistaken. And then you see in 2010 how they actually also moved from this little node here, they move towards other products in machinery and equipment and electronics. So the appearance of new exports in a country's export basket is not random. They follow some sort of pattern that has to do with the accumulated know-how that you have given your export basket today. And the way that Ricardo and his co-authors measure relatedness or proximity between products is based on the probability of countries the probability that countries co-export two products during the same period. So if you have 10 countries, 9 of them export cucumbers and 10 of them export tomatoes, so the probability that you export cucumbers, given that you export tomatoes, is very high. Okay? So they do this exercise for every pair of products in the world, and they find a matrix that defines the relatedness between each pair of products. Yet, the way they do it, this is a very strong and robust predictor of future growth, of future diversification, I'm sorry. And as Bill said, there's going to be a table, so I want to comply with that. So this is how actually this measure here is basically a measure that that is telling you, here I'm trying to explain the likelihood that a new product is going to emerge given how related it is to the rest of the export basket of the country. And we see, I don't want to get into the details, but we see that it's a very strong predictor. In fact, a new product is about 60 to 80% more likely to appear in the next decade given higher relatedness by 1 standard deviation. But the thing is that measure I just told you about of relatedness is a little bit, we don't really know what it means. I just told you 2 countries co-export the same good, or one country co-export 2 different goods. It's basically an agnostic measure. It's geographically based, but we don't really know what it really is. So a lot of what we've done in the past few years is to try to explain these agnostic measures. What is it really that is driving relatedness and the emergence of new sectors? So we dig a little bit into the black box. And what we do in a recent paper is to basically compare and do a little bit of a horse race between different channels. One of them is labor flows, whether 2 products are similar because there's a lot of workers flowing between the 2 products. The other one is demand and supply, so whether 2 sectors are similar because they have the same providers. Sorry, because one is a provider to the other or one is a buyer to the other. And the third one is technology, whether 2 products are similar because they have similar technologies. They share similar patents, they cite similar patents, and so on. And what we found actually is the second table, is that what explains the most of, this should be a little bit up here, but what explains the stronger determinant of the emergence of a new sector is actually consumer linkages. So it's the fact that, or to say it in other words, you are more likely to export a car engine if you're already exporting cars than exporting the screws for the engine. So you are more likely to export something for which potentially you already have a buyer in the local market. And this is particularly strong in developing countries where markets are less complete and more uncertain. So this is kind of the idea that purchasing orders explain a lot of your ability, lowers the risk and explain a lot of the ability to expand into newer products. So for the rest of the 15-ish minutes I have before questions, or maybe 20, I want to talk a little bit about, we talk a lot about local markets and how markets, what are the characteristics of the same country that could explain the emergence of a new sector. But I want to really focus a little bit on the international links, which is a lot of the core of what I'm doing in my research. And I want to focus on a particular issue, which is knowledge. And we mentioned before that productivity is, you gain productivity by acquiring the knowledge to do more with the same resources. This knowledge could be technology, it could be your ability to work with the machines at the factory. It could be a lot of things. But this knowledge is very difficult to transfer and to acquire, right? This is Lionel Messi. And Lionel Messi, he knows how to play soccer, right? Some people criticize him a lot, but he knows how to play soccer. So he has this knowledge on how to goal, how to score, and he knows how to do it. We can bring Lionel Messi here instead of me talking. That'd be nice. And we can have him lecture for 2 hours, 3 hours on how to be a good soccer player. And I assure you, no offense to any of you, that you're not going to get it. I assure you that he can talk to you for an hour, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we'll go to the soccer field, and we're really not going to be as good as him. And the reason is that there's a lot of know-how that is tacit, that he has because he has trained for many hours, and whatever he's doing out there that makes him such a star is not something that he can explain to us and we'll become a star as well. It's not something he can write in an email, it's not something that we can read in a patent, it's not something that we can even gain by looking at him or by having him talk to us. So the transmission of knowledge is a very, very difficult thing. And in fact, tacit knowledge which is very important for countries in order to become more productive and more competitive, travel through very narrow channels, and its diffusion is geographically localized. So knowledge doesn't travel long distances. And a lot of economists have shown this in many different ways. One way, for instance, is that patent citations are predominantly local. A lot of the patents that are produced in Silicon Valley are mostly cited by other firms in Silicon Valley and not so much in Indonesia or in India or in France. And that's intriguing. Why is it intriguing? Because, if you put out a patent, it's out there, everybody can read it, everybody can see it, but yet citing those patents are only happening within certain geographic distance. People have shown also that this is the case for R&D spillovers. So economists believe that when foreign firms come to a specific location, the other firms benefit from the technology they bring and so on. But these benefits are also bounded geographically. Only the firms that are very close by are the ones that benefit from this. So this reinforces the idea that actually know-how is very local and it diffuses very locally, and the reason for this is that a lot of this knowledge is tacit and it's very hard to transfer and to acquire. So we asked the following question. If the story I told you at the beginning is true, that exports reflect to some extent the know-how that you have, and exporting something means that you're more productive and therefore you gain the knowledge. So then exports should also follow some sort of geographic pattern. And then the question we asked is whether the emergence of a new export sector is consistent with this idea that knowledge diffuses very locally. So basically what we asked in one of our papers is to say, well, if we use a new export product as a measure of knowledge acquisition, do we see that the likelihood of that new product emerging can be explained by the fact that your neighboring country already is exporting that product? This is, of course, excluding all products that could be pinned down by geology or geography, so we're talking really about manufacturing goods. And when you come to think about it, it's not obvious that that's the case, because why is Japan and Korea all exporting very similar electronics? Well, according to trade theory, they shouldn't. They should specialize in different things because they're natural trade partners. But indeed, they are actually competing quite a bit. And to us, this is an explanation that actually knowledge diffuses very locally, and neighboring countries learn from each other, and they become competitive at the very same goods. And actually, we find that using a measure of export similarity between countries, this measure really decays strongly with distance. This is the right-hand side, so you see how similarity in exports between countries is much stronger the closer they are in terms of distance. And we also produce this network, which is a representation of this, in which each node is a country, and each country has two arrows coming out, which are the two countries that they resemble the most in terms of their export basket. So you see here something that is very striking, that all regions in the world are kind of together. So you have here France and Switzerland and Germany and Austria and Sweden and Netherlands all together. This is Western Europe. And then you have Poland and Lithuania and Belarus and Romania and Moldova, Latvia, Estonia, all Eastern Europe together. And then you move here and you have Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Namibia, Botswana, Ethiopia, all Africa together. And then here you have Ecuador, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Colombia. So you get it. So there's a very, very strong pattern on the ability, on the type of goods that you export and your geographic location. And this to us is something about the fact that knowledge travels very little distances, and it's also reflected in the kind of goods that you export. Now, these limits to the diffusion of knowledge also is even present within firms. So I was coming out of a plane in Louisville, Kentucky, and I saw this ad which says, "Welcome to Louisville. We are ideally situated 738 miles from Wall Street." Right? So you should do business with us, because for firms it also matters, distance. And the way I thought about asking this question with data is to really use a data set that has a lot of multinationals, and it has about 100 million establishments across the world. I actually geocoded each one of these establishments, and I know exactly in which city in the world they are, and that's how it looks. And I also know for each multinational where are all of their foreign branches. So this is a car manufacturing firm in the US, and these are all the foreign branches that it has. So then I asked the question, well, let's create a measure of tacit knowledge. Let's create a measure of how knowledge intensive is an economic activity. I used data on the experience, on the on-the-job experience of workers of each industry to define which industries are more knowledge intensive, tacit knowledge intensive, I must say, than others. And I find that the most knowledge intensive industries are issues such as communications equipment, radio and television, electronic resistors, electronic connectors, and so on. And the least knowledge intensive activities are sausages, meat packing plants, lodging, and so on. So then the question was, well, does this reflect anything of the way that multinational corporations locate geographically? And indeed it does. What I find is that multinational corporations are 15% less likely to horizontally expand, so that means to set up a subsidiary abroad if they're in a more knowledge-intensive activity. Which actually means, if we put it in words, that imagine you have a multinational corporation in Houston, located in Houston, it will locate a meat-packing subsidiary in Kabul, Afghanistan, and a semiconductor plant in Ireland. So actually, the same firm will decide to locate its knowledge-intensive activities nearby than further away. And this probably has to do something with their necessity to control and to monitor and to talk to their workers when the activity is much more knowledge-intensive. But then you may tell me, well, you're wrong, because what could be happening here is that some knowledge-intensive activities, they have to be located nearby because there's a lot of intermediate goods back and forth, and that's why distance matters, because you would just want a lower cost. Well, I already did this exercise, and now I started controlling for things that could ease the communication between the headquarters and the subsidiary. And for instance, when I control for the time zone, where the firm and the subsidiary are in the same time zone, the headquarters and the subsidiary, this trade-off between distance and knowledge intensity seems to almost disappear. And therefore, I'm going to tell you, well, there's no reason, if this is a trade cost story, then that cannot be true, because trade costs should be the same north to west and north to south and east to west. So the fact that the same firm is able to expand much more in terms of distance in the same time zone means that it has to do much more with their ability to communicate in real time with their workers than anything else. All right, so to finish, now that I brought up the point that knowledge travels very short distances, the one thing that I want to tell you about is about some ongoing research on the fact that we think that knowledge travels very short distances because it requires human interaction. And people don't travel that long, for that far away. So then, if that's the case, if this is about human interaction, then the patterns of the international knowledge diffusion should follow patterns of international migration. If we see we could exploit migration flows and try to see if that reflects some changes in the flow of know-how between countries. Well, that's what we did in a couple of papers. And one interesting anecdotal example is the sriracha sauce that you probably saw in many restaurants if you had Asian food recently. Or not Asian, because it's everywhere. It's a very successful firm. And I don't know if you knew, but it was founded in 1980 in California by David Tran, who was a refugee from Vietnam. And today, actually, Huy Fong, the name of the brand of this sriracha sauce, was the name of the vessel that brought him and many other refugees to the coast of California. And today, this firm employs about 200 workers, and it sells more than $60 million per year. So this is the story of somebody who came with certain knowledge, and it became an entrepreneur and brought that knowledge here, and that know-how became a product and became possibly an export. So we try to look whether this pattern is, we can see it in the data. And another great example of this is Franschhoek Valley in South Africa, which is this little town about 40 kilometers away from Cape Town in South Africa, which was founded in the late 17th century by French Huguenot refugees who were expelled from France and settled in South Africa and created this little town, which in Franschhoek in Afrikaans means the French corner. Well, 200 years later, or 300 years later, this little town has some of the most renowned wineries in South Africa that export wine to the rest of the world. So we took this question to the data and we asked a very simple question, which is, if we have two countries in the world, one of them is France that exports wine, the other one is South Africa that exports jerseys, when we see a flow of French people going to South Africa, do we see that suddenly South Africa becomes an exporter of wine, and maybe at the same time also France becomes an exporter of jerseys? So whether immigrants and emigrants can explain changes in the comparative advantage of countries. And we find that that's actually the case, that immigrants and emigrants can explain the emergence of new sectors in the economies that send them or receive them. And we do this in many different ways and many robustness tests, and we find this to be very consistent. Let me finish up with one thing that is ongoing work, which is trying to answer a very similar question, but in a setting that provides us much more evidence that this is a causal relationship, that actually is migrants moving that is causing the growth of sectors, and it's not only a correlation. And the setting we're studying right now is the Yugoslavian refugees during the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. And in particular, I think refugees is important to study because nowadays we are in the midst of a refugee international crisis. And there is a lot of uninformed statements out there talking about refugees, and actually a lot of the evidence suggests that accepting these refugees, it could be beneficial. It's not a favor we're doing to anybody. It could be beneficial to the receiving country as well. So what we do in this paper, which is in progress, is that we actually start looking at Yugoslavian refugees that left the country when the war started in 1991, because Yugoslavia started to disintegrate. And in 1992, Bosnia, one of the countries one of the states that was part of the former Yugoslavia, voted for independence, and this actually led to a very bloody war that lasted for a few years. And in 1995, they signed a peace treaty in Dayton, Ohio, after one of the most important massive forced displacements of civilian populations from Yugoslavia to the rest of the world. And actually, we know that one of the biggest recipients of these refugees was Germany. Actually, what you see here on this graph, on the blue line, is the number of Yugoslavians that the stock of Yugoslavians in Germany. And you see that after 1990, it really increases by a lot. About 600,000 refugees arrived to Germany. And you also see that after 1995, this number dropped dramatically. And the reason for it is that when the peace treaty was signed, many of these refugees that had temporary protection, this temporary protection was removed, and many of them had to go back to their home countries. So this provides for us some sort of a natural experiment to understand what happened with these refugees that spend some time in Germany in an advanced economy working, but then they have to go back for reasons other than their own decision. And then we can see what actually happened in the Yugoslavian countries in terms of the exports and the production of some goods. Actually, this is the website of CNN in HTML at the time, which shows how, and also the New York Times, which shows actually that after the peace treaty was signed, they were really forced to be, they were really repatriated, and many of them went back. And we know where each of these individuals work because we had access to the Social Security data, anonymized of course, but we know how many Yugoslavians, people with Yugoslavian passports were working in each sector. And what you see here is that in this graph, each one of these dots is basically a sector, a 4-digit sector. And what you see is the number of Yugoslavian workers in these sectors in 1995 against the workers of the workers in the same sectors in 2000. And the fact that all the points are below the 45-degree line, it means that all sectors experienced a loss of Yugoslavian workers in Germany. So what we know is that the same sectors that experienced this loss, the sectors that received more return migrants, are the ones that afterwards grew the most in the Yugoslavian countries after 1995. And this is the line up here. This is the line of the sectors that received more return migrants. And this is the line of the sector, the second set of sectors that received most Yugoslavian return migrants. And these are the ones that almost didn't receive any. So we see that actually the know-how that these people received while they were working in Germany, in a much more advanced economy, they brought it with them, and now it played a very important role in the development of the former Yugoslavian countries. In fact, when we compare whether the same industries were also growing in other similar economies, such as Bulgaria and Romania, we find that that's not the case. So this is like the same estimator for Romania and Bulgaria, and you see that they're not different from zero in terms of statistical significance. Whereas for Yugoslavia, it remains positive, implying that not only Yugoslavia grew in sectors that the workers were in, but it's sort of like they skipped a level of development. They're actually doing now products they were doing products that were not the same products that their peers in terms of GDP per capita and location were doing. Actually, we also find that this effect is much stronger when we're looking at skilled migrants. In particular, we find that it is much stronger in occupations that are considered white collars as opposed to non-white collars. For instance, managements. Managers play a very important role in this transmission of knowledge. We also see that it's very important for analytical and cognitive skill occupations that are intensive in analytical cognitive skills as opposed to manual, and in occupations that are intensive that have a high problem-solving content as opposed to low problem-solving. So this all suggests that this is a lot about the knowledge and the know-how that is being transferred across borders. Just to finish up with some more general statistics about migration, because I think, again, it's a topic that it's out there being discussed in the public stage, and there's a lot of uninformed statements, and I think it's important to understand in general that most of the evidence suggests that the benefits of accepting migrants outweighs all the possible risk or cost of doing so. For instance, in the US, migrants are 15% of the population. So the US has a very large migrant population. But they represent about 27% of the entrepreneurs in the country. So migrants are they're overly entrepreneur more than the rest of, more than their fair share. Then there are about 37% of new firms that have at least one immigrant entrepreneur in their starting team. And there are about 25% of employees in new firms that are immigrants. So migrants are actually a very important input of the growth engine in the US and also in the world. In fact, these small firms that are the ones that migrants are more likely to create are the ones that create more jobs. And these small firms are the ones that create about 1.5 million jobs a year in the US during the past decade. So we see a lot of the current political debate claiming that all the possible things that cost the 5 or 6 million jobs in manufacturing, but the way that the administration, for instance, is responding to is by curbing trade, curbing globalization, curbing migration, whereas actually the right way to do it is to find ways for the whole economy to become more competitive, and part of it has to do with accepting migration and even refugees. So just to finish up, some insights on the role of policy. Economic diversification is full of market failures, so there is space for public policy there. And one way that I like to think about policy, there are some of the students that I talked to today about this today, is to ask this question. Because we can easily talk about policy, but policy is something very critical. So this phrase means, what's the failure? Okay, so what's the market failure? So when we talk about policy, we have to really understand, we have to really address a market failure that is happening. Markets are there, markets work, but there are plenty of failures when we think about markets, and public policy should address those failures to really help firms and help entrepreneurs to achieve their goals. So there are many market failures that could be out there. And then the question when it comes to immigration and the role of know-how, for instance, and how knowledge diffuses, whether there is a market failure there to fix, and probably there is, because this is a very imperfect process. in which know-how doesn't flow as freely as we think. And therefore, there is some space for policy. And I think one that we could focus or we can think about, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, is the idea of labor mobility and how actually there could be a much better, there's a lot of room to improve in terms of global governance, in terms of promoting labor mobility and having people move from one country to the other, even if it's temporary, to learn from the others and then come back and promote and foster growth and development. So with that, let me thank you for coming, and these are my contact information. Feel free to email me. And so we have time for questions, right?
What's the role of capital, the source of capital? And relatedness, for example, I've lived in Brazil, I've lived in Nigeria, and that tends to be a few very rich investors who are very successful in one sector, and they're familiar with that sector, so there would be some motivation, I would think, to go into somewhat familiar territory from that core sector. And I noticed that it's not showing up as one of your key variables.
You mean capital is not showing up? Like
capital investment explicitly.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I completely understood it, but what you're describing of the way investors behave is consistent with the idea that there are some products that are related, and then when you acquire the know-how in something, you move to something else. The reason that I put less emphasis on capital is because capital is supposed to be something that can freely move. There are some market failures, but in general, it moves. I mean, if you have, in a perfect world, in a perfect scenario, and it's more reflective of the world today, if you have the resources, you can acquire machinery, right? And there is a part of know-how that is in machines, right? You don't need to know how to add and subtract if you have a calculator. The machine will do it for you. But the part of know-how that really struggles to travel is the part that is tacit, that is not in the machine, and that's why the focus was more on that. Sure.
Yes, and it's very interesting about, and I know you're talking extensively about your export basket, and that chart was very interesting with the different countries. They certainly have specialties in export. But I think it would be interesting too, of course I guess that's because of an interest of mine, but to see also what happens with the import basket. So in other words, you know, and how does that look when you look at one versus the other? Because I guess, you know, for example, you know, we take perhaps even a disproportionate amount of oil from Saudi Arabia, and we could be doing other things, but to look at that versus exports to that area, you know, to look at the two baskets, plus and minus for each area or even each country for the larger countries.
Yeah. I haven't looked at that, to be honest, but I think it's a good point. I guess that a lot of it will be similar also because if you're exporting similar things, you might be importing the same intermediate goods. So you will see a lot of that, but it's very hard to disentangle exactly what is the mechanism behind it. But that's a great point. Thank you. Yes.
I mean, you have pretty old data, 20, 50 years old data. Now we have the internet, 10 years, the last 10 years, and accelerated knowledge exchange via the internet. I mean, in some way, we don't need to move to other countries in order to acquire new technologies, new experiences, and so on. It is much easier now. So can you see this in more recent data, that kind of effect?
It's a great question, and there are two answers to it, I think. The first one is that there is a great paradox that economists are trying to answer. How come there's so much technological improvement, such as the internet and whatever, Uber and whatever, everything that we have, or Nest that we can control the temperature instead of the home from the phone. But it's not being reflected in productivity numbers. It's not being reflected in economic growth. So how come there's so much?
You are not measuring that.
So there is a measurement error. There could be a measurement error there. we were talking about it in a class before, the fact that, I mean, we are all more productive probably because of Google. We can go and Google something, and that before that it took us like 10, maybe 5 hours to find out the same answer. But because Google offer their services for free, they don't account that as a sale. So we don't really know, there's that component there, but there's a very important work from Chad Syverson from the University of Chicago that has shown that even when there is some measurement, it cannot account for all the measurement, for all the gap that exists in terms of the productivity slowdown that more or less started in 2004. And what we found a little bit on the research is that part of what explains that slowdown is the fact that diffusion has become even harder across firms within the same sector. So we see that very large firms are still innovating and growing, but the firms that are like lower in the productivity scale, they're for some reason not adopting those technologies. And there could be many reasons. It could be that these technologies are harder. It could be that they're scared of being sued by a patent troll. It could be many reasons. So that answer is just to tell you that even though technology is happening, it's not fully reflected on the numbers yet. And that's kind of a paradox that we don't know. And the other question is that I think that you're right, that we could think that a lot of these, a lot of the internet and Skype and FaceTime can substitute this face-to-face interaction. But actually, I haven't done a project that looks at that in particular, but anecdotally at least, we see that it hasn't been able to substitute all of it. There's still a lot of business travel. People travel for business all the time. A lot of the meetings maybe happen through Skype, but still it hasn't been completely substituted. And I think that there's something about the human interaction that is face-to-face that is very important in this transfer of technology and know-how that cannot be, that is substituted. I don't know why, but I think that that's a very key point. Thank you. I want to give the right to, sorry.
I like the finding, especially with the case of Yugoslavia, because return migration is quite an interesting case. Because, to me, that's not necessarily the truth for many of the other countries. Because, the return migration, usually, if, let's say, an immigrant is from poor country, underdeveloped country to the United States, and he or she stayed here long enough to acquire skills and knowledge, they tend to not to go back to their country, first of all. And even if they go back to the country, they don't necessarily start entrepreneurs or some of those same sectors. Rather, with the fortune not from the United States, they start small businesses, and that's a typical case. So on top of that, the mobility itself is, especially the international and also interregional labor mobility is going down. Actually, mobility rate is going down, especially among the millennials. So if you take a look at more closely why that type of knowledge spillover through this migration is in general going down, especially the unidirectional from the poor country to the rich countries. And that's something that, especially for the paper they are currently working on, it will be interesting to take a look at more closely.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the one answer I have is that I agree with most of the things you said, and I haven't really looked at very much data on what is the rate of return in different countries. I don't really know if it's high or low, so I take your word for it. But I think that return migration is one channel. I mean, I think that there still can be a lot of economic benefits from having a diaspora, even if they never return. And another good example is the Vietnamese diaspora in the U.S. that, for instance, it has created very strong trade links between the U.S. and Vietnam, for example. And there's a very neat experiment that looks at that, because a lot of these Vietnamese refugees that arrive were, for some reason, randomly distributed in different states of the U.S. And that provides like another natural experiment to look at what happens between each one of these states and trade with Vietnam. And you see that actually in the states that more refugees settled are the states that today are trading more with Vietnam. So I was just talking about a particular channel, which is the know-how that translates into exports and so on. But there are many other channels that also play a role, such as creating the network and the links between each pair of countries that make trade flows better and capital flows better and so on. So I think that the diasporas also play a role, even if they don't come back. Yes.
Question about population growth, demographic growth as it relates to GDP. So, opening chart was that hockey stick. Well, that's when we broke the billion people. Now we have 7. So, how much does population growth factor in? And I guess the underlying question is sustainability of growth.
Well, that's a good question. So everything I showed was GDP per capita.
Okay.
So it's accounting for population growth. I think that's particularly a challenge for countries that rely on natural resources, for instance. Venezuela, where I grew up and was raised, in the 70s was a very rich country because they have all this oil for 5 million people. Now they have 30 million people. And they never diversified. And not only that, but they have the worst government that ever existed in the history of humankind. Not the worst, but among the worst. So I think that's particularly troubling for these countries that are not able to diversify. So that will be my answer. There was another question here, yes.
Yeah, have they seen from companies when they globalize and they bring their manufacturing technologies overseas to places that didn't previously had it? Do they see now that those countries have emerging technologies in diversified fields or related fields?
I think your broad answer is yes. I haven't done that. I haven't looked at this particular, but there's a lot of research showing how FDI, which would be part of the story you're telling, really plays a role in promoting productivity in the receiving countries. So I think that will be aligned with what you're saying. Yeah, FDI has a lot of positive spillover. There's a reason that countries promote FDI that strongly because they know that it's a way for them to bring technologies and know-how and so on. Yes.
So you showed the side of Yugoslavians coming back from Germany. What did the Germany side look like when they were there? What did Germany benefit from having all those Yugoslavians there?
So that's a question I've been asked quite a bit, and I haven't looked at it. Part of the reason is that it's hard to look at it because I don't know where the migrants were working before. So it's kind of like an unfair comparison. So here I know where they worked, and I can see the sectors after they return. But I don't know anything about them before they arrived to Germany. So I could see at some summary statistics and so on, but any conclusion I will make is really not a causal statement. It will be more of a correlation. But it's hard to say because if the German economy is growing, which probably was the case in that time, it's going to be very hard to establish that growth was because of the refugees or because of something else. So that's kind of the not so exciting answer.
At least it was honest.
Thank you.
I always hate to stop this, but I want to be respectful of your time and our colleagues who are working here. But we'll stay around if you have an unasked question or two. Thank you again for coming out. As I mentioned, I don't have a next lecture to invite you to or promote, but if we have your email, you'll be getting information about our lecture series this spring and everything else that we're up to. If we don't have your email, please get it to us so we can stay in touch with you. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
I don't know if you can notice it.